And welcome back to Immigration Ain't Easy. I'm Mo Goldman, the host, and I am joined today by Anatoly, also known as Tola, and his last name is Molotkov, which hopefully I did not butcher totally. Tola, we'll just stick with Tola. It's a lot easier. So Tola is an immigrant writer. He immigrated to the United States from Russia when he was 22 years old. He grew up in St. Petersburg, and he is a poet. He's also authored several novels, one of which is going to be coming out. He's coming out with it in publication very soon, although when this podcast comes out, it might already have been released. The title of the book is A Bag Full of Stones, and it does have some interesting ties to immigration and right-wing violence, based out of 2019, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct, Tola?
That's correct.
So being that this is an immigration-based podcast, let's kick it off with a little bit of immigrant-based questions. So Tola, you tell us a little bit about what life was like for you growing up in St. Petersburg, and I guess generally, how did your upbringing eventually become something where you decided that you wanted to become a writer?
Well, thank you so much, first of all, for having me, and it's a true pleasure to talk to you. I appreciate all you do for the immigrant community. I also want to ask you later about it some more, but I'm honored to be here. So to go back to your question, the time that I lived in the Soviet Union, which was my first 22 years, was really a strange time. The strange part of living in a totalitarian regime is that things feel maybe okay, but they're not quite there. So you notice these edges of fear in people's behavior that kind of cue you in. Not everything is all right. And I think I've come to think about the human condition under those circumstances as being somewhat infantilized. It's a population that's trained not to have independent thought, and especially not to share independent thought, but to stick to the official language. And I think that's, as the older I grew past my teenage years, the more it felt as a infliction upon my rights, everyone's rights, and just a super unhealthy way to be. So that's essentially my experience of living my first, I guess, third of my life in the Soviet Union. But luckily, my parents were college professors, and they were book-friendly people who were sometimes, as I grew older, able to share their true opinions with me. And they had to be careful, because if I were to repeat them to my friends at school, they could be in trouble. So they had to tread a careful line between being able to speak honestly about the situation in the country and not get in trouble. So eventually I was able to have those conversations about how corrupt the regime was and how hopeless the situation was in the Soviet Union. And I suppose the other attribute that I'm grateful for to my parents is the ability to make that decision. As you asked me, how did I make that decision? It was tough because I was leaving my family behind and everyone I knew, but I had that somehow, I had that ability to make decisions in me that had been encouraged. And
So let me ask you, you grew up, it seems like your parents encouraged more of a kind of open mind, a little more discourse, and in living in that sort of environment, and the ability to open your mind with like reading books and having, that around you. Did you see others who were in your, in your neighborhood or friends who didn't have that opportunity?
So I think my answer to this may be very subjective because I lived, as you said, in St. Petersburg, which was called Leningrad after the famous criminal at the time. And so for me, I was surrounded by my parents, their friends, and friends I made chose myself. So in a way, I was exposed to maybe a more selected group of more cultured people. So to some degree, I don't really know what level of sincere belief in the communist language existed outside that. But I think the country was pretty cynical about the whole Soviet thing.
Now
Over
we're talking like the 70s and 80s, right? Like that was the general time that you were growing up there, post Lenin.
right.
And so you, when you were there, did you study like in a university for a while, or what did you do when you finished your primary or secondary education?
I was supposed to become a scientist like my parents, and I was really good at math. So I enrolled in Leningrad State, now St. Petersburg State, for math and physics. And my major was going to be mathematical physics, which is like the most abstract physics out there that is rendered through mathematical formulas that are quite complex. And that was going to be my field. I was already convinced that I was interested in being an artist, but in Soviet Union, the paths to being that did not go through studying at school because the study of anything humanitarian, of literature, or anything having to do with history or human rights would have been very ideology based. So basically, you couldn't really go study as a writer. There would be no point in doing that. I stuck with math for 3 years until I actually decided I had to leave that and the country all at the same time.
Why did you decide to leave and come to the United States? Was it more to, flourish in your ability to be an artist and a writer, or was there other reasons why you decided to leave at that time?
My two friends had emigrated a year and 2 years before me, respectively, and at that time I was really shocked by their choice. But the more the situation unfolded, the less hopeful it felt about how Russia was going to develop. Sure, we had perestroika and glasnost from Gorbachev. They were great initiatives, but even so, it didn't feel like there was a solution to the vast array of problems that the country was experiencing. And so it felt very hopeless. The more I stayed, the more hopeless it felt. And additionally, in parallel with that, my study of math and physics became more and more difficult for me because I was just not interested. So I was cramming the information into my head to pass the tests, but
A waste.
wasn't there.
It became a wasteland of information in your brain.
Yes, it did. It did. And in fact, I had to tell my quantum mechanics professor that I was immigrating and to convince him to give me a C for one of my classes. That was my worst mark over the 3 years, but I was like, this stuff is so complex and it's just, I can't wrap my head around that anymore.
So your parents were scientists, correct? Both of them, or okay?
My dad in particular was a scientist and a professor. My mom was more a college professor in the sense that she did more teaching than research. She did some, but that wasn't her main focus.
And did they teach at what was Leningrad State originally, and then also at was it St. Petersburg?
So my dad taught at Leningrad State, and in fact, I took a course from him. He was really good. And then my mom taught at a different college in St. Petersburg. Um,
Um, and so, what was their thought when you decided, you know what, I don't want to go down the same path as you guys? It sounds like they were pretty open to cultivating your own identity, right?
to some degree, while they were in general open to me having my own opinions, they are also pretty opinionated about my future as a math or physics person, and uh, uh, for good reasons, concerned about my future as a writer anywhere, which isn't much of a future as far as earning a living is concerned.
Mhm.
So
So,
my goal was, sorry, go ahead.
oh no, you go ahead.
My goal was always to find a way where I can have a job and then write in my spare time. That was my ambition.
So when you arrived in the United States, we were just finished with, the end of the Cold War. You had, I think, Clinton was the president in the United States at the time.
Right.
You had Gorbachev,
Mhm.
and how did you come here initially to study? Like, what was your mechanism to getting to the U.S. originally, or did you come in on a different type of visa, or what was your pathway?
I came on a tourist visa and then applied for a political asylum. And that was still pending 10 years later when I actually ended up getting married. And so the political asylum application kind of fell aside. I don't think I would have been granted that
I
anymore at
mean,
that.
unbelievably, 10 years, and we hear this all the time that, I mean, it actually brings me to a story um, I recall was a Bulgarian client of mine who came right around the same time you did and had asked for asylum. And he waited and waited and waited. He did not finally get a final decision on his case till 2006.
Wow.
And so when that happens, you come to the U.S. You have to get basically work permits, right? You had to renew that on a
Every
regular
year.
basis,
Mhm.
and your life is basically in a state of limbo.
It is. It is. Except I sort of decided there was no way I'm going back to Russia. So whatever it was going to take, but in practical terms, I'm not really sure what that would have been.
Did you did you ever go back, like even after you got your green card, or I'm assuming now maybe a citizen in the U.S.? Did you ever
Yes,
go back to Russia?
I went back twice. One time I had to go after my mom died in 2005 and just take care of some business stuff related to our former apartment. And the second time, my partner Lori convinced me to take her in 2011. She is from Michigan, but her dad used to travel to Russia for work, and so she had a fascination with this country, and she basically wouldn't take no for an answer. I was, and I am extremely afraid of that country, and at this point, I don't think I'm going back
What
anymore.
about the separation? Now, this is always I'd say, kind of emotional, difficult thing to talk about for some people, a lot of people. Being separated from your family, like, did they have the opportunity to come visit the US while you were here, or were you basically unable to see your mother and father or any other relatives there?
I was able to see my mother several years later when she was able to travel. I obviously couldn't travel at all safely and hope to get back in until I became
Resident.
right, which was after I got married in 2000. I'm sorry, 1996. So um, at that point, I may have been able to travel, but I was still very afraid also. And my mom, though, was a fan of traveling. She went to Europe and other places after the Iron Curtain was lifted, and it became possible for folks there to travel. So she came and visited starting in mid-90s. I got to see her every year or two. She would come out.
If I say these two words, what do you what comes to mind? And I think this is not a trick question. It is I think a valid question, and maybe looking at it in the context of when you came to the U.S. Or let's look at it two ways. I say these two words. What did they mean to you when you came to the United States or before you came here versus today? Like, how would you define it? And the two words are American dream.
Yes, it's a great question. And by the way, I wanted to quickly plug my memoir that's coming out about a year from now. It's called A Broken Russia Inside Me. It just recently won a small press contest. So I'm writing about these things in depth in there. But this is so interesting because when we grew up in Russia, it may be hard to imagine for an American listener, but we were extremely cut off from the information about the world. It's not like we could even open New York Times, for example, and read what they wrote about it. We had just our newspapers, and the information was very filtered. So the idea of America was that of a superior place for several reasons. One of them being that the Soviet Union was so against it, so it must be a cool place. So the Soviet leaders were so afraid of it. And secondly, where the news didn't penetrate to us, but certain cultural artifacts did. So we'd see some films that weren't that problematic from the Soviet position. And so we could see how people presumably lived. We had access to some literature, maybe not necessarily current, but older literature. For example, we had some Hemingway books that, while not sold in stores, they were published in small prints and you could find. We had The Catcher in the Rye was translated in, probably in the 80s, in the 1980s. And so I read it. And although, of course, that deals with past America, but that's kind of a sort of part of the answer is how separated we were from real news. So we made our impressions based on older books and carefully selected films that were making it to us. And, just general word of mouth. And it felt as though America was a place where things are pretty functional. Of course, I knew that if somebody is rich, they have more access to goods and choices than maybe they should. That I knew of, but some of the other problems in America I certainly was unaware of, in particular racism and the right-wing mentality, the everything we fight against now as liberals. I wasn't aware that alongside these advanced and progressive people, there would be like these really backwards people who basically have no place in America the way I imagined it. But yeah, there were like 45%. So that slowly grew on me, and especially as the Bush election transpired, it was just like, what? The Supreme Court just decided that this guy who didn't win a popular vote gets to be president because there's 5 Republicans on the Supreme Court. That was a real wake-up call for me. And since then, I, of course, have modified my views on America, where I think it's still a good place. I mean, current events notwithstanding, but it has massive problems too.
Yeah, and I think that's part of our entire learning process is that, especially when you lived in Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, Russia, at a time where a lot of your information was filtered, especially, but we didn't have access to internet and information that now is more accessible, although some countries still will, prevent people and filter that. But yeah, it is an interesting thing to think about, that, you have this idyllic, vision that you're coming to the US and it's going to be this like, great place where, of course, it's not, where you left from, and it's going to be better because of that. But it has its problems. Actually, one question: growing up in the United States as a kid in the '80s, I always wondered about this, and maybe you can tell me: did Rocky IV ever make it to your homeland?
That's an, I'm not
Talk
sure.
about propaganda.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I saw any Iraqi films.
No.
They might have. I was into art films, so I would
Okay.
watch
Well,
Noni and Bertolucci and
you weren't into Sylvester Stallone
some,
boxing films.
not so much, but I think I caught up on them at some point.
Well, yeah.
One or two of those at some point, just to see what they were in the '90s when I came here.
It was just, I mean, for anyone who never saw Rocky IV, it was Rocky Balboa, played by Sylvester Stallone, is now going to take on Ivan Drago, the bad Russian boxer, and they end up boxing. Well, Ivan Drago kills Apollo Creed in the ring in a like a just kind of fun match, and he just goes off and beats him up in the ring, and then Rocky ends up avenging his death by going to Russia and beating Drago in Russia, and all the fans suddenly turn and become big fans of the American boxer. Which,
okay, that sounds very familiar. I think I got caught up on that in the '90s.
that is the synopsis of that film in about 1 minute.
I think sorry, it was funny to me that the guy who played the evil Russian boxer, I don't think he was Russian. I think he was of some kind of other.
Yeah, he's not, from my recollection also. So in preparing to talk to you about your works, I found a poem that you wrote called Theory of Anger, Dogs, and By the Way of Scars. And that poem, it talks about, it opens with, when anger is gone, what is left? Actually, I'll just read it real quick if you don't mind.
Thank you.
When anger is gone, what is left? Just because history ends one day, can we say there is no room for permanence? We carry ours with us for a while, new generations, new eternities, and so on. A letter in the mail, never arriving. A dog left in the cellar with a chain on the neck where fur used to be. We call this memory, the bark, the scars. Say fear. When fear is gone, what is left? Is that what we call love? The letter is in the wrong mailbox. Small hands open the door. I read that, and I mean, to me, obviously, poetry and writing is always open for interpretation. And I think about, and you can tell me what inspired you to write that, but I think about the thoughts of fear, and, when fear is gone, what is left? And does that mean when fear is gone, is love, what remains? And, that, we're living in a world that seems to often be directed by fear, unfortunately, and which causes anger. And if we can somehow get rid of this fear, will that benefit future generations? Now, that's the way I kind of interpreted it. What was your thought process in that?
I think I'll do like a free interpretation of my poem. I don't try to put particular thoughts into a poem, but I like to leave a poem open to the reader's capability to interpret. So um, that's usually my approach. But clearly, the imagery here refers to sort of a longevity of fear. How, well, when fear is gone, there's still the repercussions of the fear. And so I think this tries to point out that things are basically complicated. You can get rid of the fear and have nothing to replace it with, or you can have the fear gone and have emptiness, and still the symptoms of the former fear would dominate the reality that you inhabit, such as the dog here. And that's I think that's the territory that I was exploring with here.
What is your process? Like, do you have a specific process that you follow when you do either like poetry or prose? Like, how do you go about, coming up and generating this sort of art?
It's quite different, and that goes to what you mentioned earlier, the choice to write both poetry and prose. For prose, it has to be a very deliberate effort. It has to be careful work that you do over weeks and months. And for me, the prose takes on more of a real quality where in my younger years, I wrote some magic realism, but nowadays I'm just more interested in the real reality as we see it or as the character sees it. And that takes a lot of careful planning. You have to think about the characters' parents, children, their partners, their friends. You have to decide which of those to incorporate. So I almost think of characters in fiction as actual people. I have to take time to interrogate and to get to know and to learn what they're about, what their past is. For me, that's an emergent process that takes a long time. Whereas for the poem, it's more a kernel of thought or emotion that I want to share quickly, but also ambiguously, with an intentional ambiguity that seeks, as I said just a minute ago, to allow the reader to step into that interpretive space. And so for a poem, I would often jot it down quickly and might revise it, but my goal is to leave it somewhat unclear, so the reader would actually have questions about what in fact is being said, or what is the message here, what do I take away. Yeah, in that sense, it's a different process. It's more like, okay, I'm inspired to write a poem now, I'm going to do that, but I'm going to spend 2 or 3 hours tonight working on my next novel.
Right now, are you more focused on writing novels, or do you do both poetry and prose currently?
I always do both, but of course, prose takes about 99% of my time, and sometimes I'll just jot down a poem. I've already published 4 books of poetry, and I feel as though I don't want to publish 30 more. I want to publish maybe 4 or 6 more. I mean, maybe I'll change my mind about these numbers as the years go by, but there's a certain challenge in getting away from your own voice. And I don't want to overuse the same voices that I've already developed. So the poetry is just something I do a little bit. Prose writing is a real effort. It's like where you decide, I'm not going out with friends. I'm writing my novel tonight, type of thing.
Sure. And let me ask you, and I think, I'll ask you, or we'll reiterate this later. Where can people purchase your books? Like, are they just on Amazon, or are they in stores? Like, where can people find your books?
People can definitely find most of my books on Amazon and big sites like that. And with the exception of maybe one or two that might have been temporarily out of print because of the recent collapse of small press distribution, although that has been rectified by many presses and they've made new arrangements. So, most of my books would be on Amazon. There was one poetry book, my second one, Application of Shadows, published by a press that only sell their own books. So they're called Main Street Rag. So my second book would be available from them only, but the rest should be available elsewhere too.
Great. Have you, when you have done your publications, have you been contacted by anyone who wants to turn any of it into film, or have you been involved in any sort of film medium?
I wish that were the case, but we'll see if anything comes through with my novels. This is my first novel, actually, that's coming out now in 2 weeks. I have participated in making experimental films myself and with my partner, Scott, who is my good friend still, but we were part of this group, Discord Aggregate, that was active in the Bay Area in late 90s and early 2000s. And with this friend of mine, we've made several experimental films. They are not really...
nothing mainstream.
Nothing mainstream, right? They're pretty experimental. You can find them online and on DVD, but it's a little different kind of material.
So let's talk about A Bag Full of Stones. It's a literary crime story that examines right-wing violence in 2019 America.
Right.
Why don't you just give a little synopsis of what the book is about, and what was your motivation to write this novel?
Sure. Thanks for that question. A Bag Full of Stones is about a serial killer who operates in Portland, Oregon, and is targeting minorities, in particular Muslims, and he thinks that that's what the country and the president want from him. He's very much, a listener to the right-wing kind of voices, and so he decides to take the matter into his own hands. He's also an unhinged individual with a severe drinking problem, and his mind is not very straight most of the time. He's taking care of his dying mother, and as he's doing these crimes, and he's thinking very highly of his effort for the country. In the meantime, the two detectives who are trying to solve the crime are a little distracted, and in this particular novel, it is the actual victims of the crimes who are somehow contributing to the investigation. So there is a magic element, I guess you would say, that's very minor in the book, but you have the victims sort of sending information to the detectives, so trying to influence their work in these intangible ways. So we don't really know if that's actually working or if that's what these recently dead individuals think is happening, but that's part of the story. So it's a little nonlinear in that way. And as to your second question, what made me tackle that topic, I really felt there was a lack of that in American literature. I can only think of just a couple of books that reference right-wing violence. Same with the TV, whereas in European TV and maybe literature have more of that, more of the desire to tackle those themes. I got really tired of seeing plots about Islamic terrorist trope because, first of all, it's not really predominant here in this country, and secondly, it's so overused. Whereas I think the right-wing violence happens, and we kind of write it off, or not we, but people who formulate the language, write it off as it's not terrorism. It's just somebody's crazy or somebody committed a crime. So I wanted to engage with that genuinely and to have a story where um, those
Kind of
terrible
turn the tables a bit. Yeah.
right and just to explore what kind of thinking leads one to actually becoming violent and who the players are and what they listen to, including our current president who uh, openly calls for violence or not so openly, depending on which quote you use. But
He uses dog whistles a lot of times.
right,
Uh,
definitely.
and you used Portland as the background for this novel, which is interesting because you always think of Portland as this very like liberal bastion of our San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, up that coast. But the reality is there are very extremist right wing groups that have used Portland as a proving ground for the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers. And I would imagine, you've had to witness this happening in your backyard firsthand, right?
Yes, these kinds of groups really try to provoke the situation here for whatever reasons they have. But um, of course, when you have a president who would rather attack the liberal establishment in the city than would attack the actual criminals who commit crimes, then it's a sort of a mixed bag. As you said, while it's a progressive city, it's definitely one where there's a lot of different groups, and there's really bad racist history in Oregon too. Until mid 19th century, people of color couldn't even freely move to Oregon, and it's just like recovering from this now. But it has those elements still present, especially if you drive away 20 miles from Portland, then you're in definitely Trump country.
And so the process of actually, coming out with this book, have you done a lot of interviews already? Are you going to be doing like book readings, or what's that process like for you?
I have done some interviews with a press that's putting it out, Apprentice House Press from Loyola University, and my official book launch is here in Portland on May 29th. I've discussed doing other events and interviews that I think are coming up also closer to the event. So a little bit of everything. It's a small press, so I'm not getting some kind of book tour or a super cool promotional package, but you take what you can get. And I've been really moved by the interest that folks seem to have for this theme, and the responses I've received so far in places like NetGalley and Goodreads from some of the folks who've already read the book.
Did I'd say, looking at what's happening in this country right now, do you see parallels in some ways to the country you left?
Yes, for sure. So when we talk about Russia these days, the word fascism comes to mind as a fair label to describe what's going on there, where the whole national identity of Ukrainians is just declared a non-existent identity, essentially a subset of the Russian world, as Putin would have it. So both that rhetoric and the actual torture and other crimes against humanity that were perpetrated during this war make it a fair assessment, I think. Fascism. Also, people call it Rushism as a kind of combined word of between them, obviously between the two roots. As to here in America, There is definitely a strong fascist tendency in the Republican world, in the right wing world, where it's become more important to support their leader than it is to support any kind of um, fair process or rights, individual rights, or anything at all. It's just like we win at any cost. And it's been somewhat a subtext, of course, for Republican politics for a while now, but it had never been as extreme. And so the willingness of people to throw out the due process is definitely leaning towards fascism. We we don't have an actual fascism as such yet, but it's very troublesome. And how does that affect you as an immigration lawyer? Does it make it more difficult?
It's tough. I mean, the problems we see in our field are, obviously pretty plentiful, and it's not just what we have seen in the most common, current environment, but it's also something that has happened, unfortunately, progressively over the past 30 to 40, maybe even longer, decades, years, 30, 40 years back, where the policies continue to get more and more restrictive for immigrants. And it's also a problem with a system that is not very functional. So when you have a combination of bad policy and bad, functionality, it's a recipe for disaster. And case in point, somebody who arrives on our shores seeking asylum because they fear going back to their country should not have to wait a decade to have their claim heard. And what I've seen, just to give you some perspective of current times, I've had clients who filed for asylum in 2014, 2015, who haven't even had their interview yet. And it's forcing a lot of them to make a difficult choice, which is whether they should sue the government, because there is a mechanism to sue. It's called a writ of mandamus. Might be something you'll want to look into writing about at some point, but it's the writ of mandamus is the only real mechanism that the immigrant has to take the power back or even get a little bit of empowerment, because they can sue the government and basically, in doing so, force the government to act, to do their job in a reasonable manner in period of time. But, the reality is that also takes resources, which a lot of immigrants don't have, because it's hard for them. They are on the ground floor, and it's hard to elevate and have enough resources and income to fight the government and sue the government.
Sure.
And knowledge. They may not know that that is an option. And then it becomes a question of, is it worth it to them to actually sue the government and get an interview, because maybe their claim that was good a decade ago is not that great anymore
Right.
because of all the time that's passed, which might have been part of an issue with your situation, that, you left a communist, country that was, trending towards a social democracy, but still had a lot of the hangover and problems. And it was the same thing that happened with my Bulgarian client, the same exact issue. By 2006, his asylum claim was not great. I mean, in the sense of, how do I prove that he was going to, end up, if he got sent back to Sofia, facing persecution there at the time. And
Sure.
so, yeah, it was tough. And it is tough. And the due process issue, when we start to see how, our Constitution, that is, really the one thing that differentiates this country from so many others, is basically getting chopped up, and due process is part of that, where you see this executive branch using it and weaponizing it, not only in favor of people who they want to, give support to, like, people who, you know, basically attacked our capital, and letting them get away with that while they go after other people and ship people off to El Salvador.
Yeah, it's terrifying, and terrifyingly cynical.
Let me ask also, you came to the US, were you fluent in English, or did you I know you had done reading like Catcher in the Rye and a lot of other books, but those had been, I think you said, translated into Russian. So coming to the US, were you bilingual, or did you have to learn English when you got here?
I guess I was 1.5 lingual, if that's a word. I had the privilege of studying English some with a private tutor over my time at school. So sort of slow pace, but a long time, and so I had a fair amount of English in terms of having access to vocabulary and grammar for the most part. But at the same time, when I started talking to people, I realized I had no idea what they were saying. And it took me some time to overcome that barrier of actually understanding the spoken English, as people tend to mumble and speak very fast. And so that was tough. And then the second challenge, of course, was to actually start writing in English as a writer after spending maybe 8 years or so perfecting my skills in Russian. I was like, okay, that makes no sense anymore. So I need to switch. And yes, it took some effort to compensate for that difference of having the well-controlled language to write in.
How did you end up in Portland? Was like when you first got here, did you live on the West Coast or did you live somewhere else? And how did you end up where you are now?
I lived in Albany, New York for the first, 5 years. And it was kind of it's a state capital, kind of a smaller city that's a little crappy, you might say, if you if you had the privilege of knowing more about America. For me at the time, it was fine. It was just a place where things weren't that expensive, and I could go to New York City and take a bus every few weeks and visit the city. So that was my first dip into America, and it worked out. I could have a job at the deli and also have tons of time to write. Then my friend Scott, whom I mentioned, who was also in Albany at the time, and I decided to finally get out of there. We were going to move to a bigger city, whether it's LA or Chicago or San Francisco or one of maybe Boston or New York City. So we made a short list of cool cities. Finally settled in San Francisco because it just seemed like a really good one at the time. I had never been, and so much literature occurs there. Like if you read Jack Kerouac, so much happens in California in the Bay Area. So yeah, we rented an apartment over the phone and moved to San Francisco and started making connections with California artists to do music and literature together. And that's how I met my ex-wife too. She was a composer who responded to our ad, and also a member of that group Discord Aggregate that I mentioned. So that was my first location, and I lived in San Francisco and in Berkeley until 2003. At that point, my ex and I were hoping to buy a house, but once we started looking at the prices, the nearest we could afford would be 3 hours out of San Francisco. We were like, okay, that's not, if we live 3 hours away from the city, we'd never go. At that time, her sister was a real estate agent in Portland, and so it transpired sort of by semi-accident that we came and checked it out, and we liked it. We liked the river, and of course, the emerging liberal vibe of the city, and yeah, that's how I ended up here. But I really like it. I sort of think of it as the next San Francisco, where things are kind of getting to that vibe. But now it's really liberal. Some of the longest protests that occurred during the George Floyd events were here in Portland. So I'm glad to have chosen that because it's getting better in that sense. You know, it has all kinds of other problems with particularly real estate and homelessness. And that's not unique to Portland, but
No.
I like it.
Did you go to Albany because that's where some of your friends had landed? Like, just,
Yes.
just guessing that's the case, because usually, you get to a new country and you have to at least find somewhere to crash, right?
Yes, exactly. A friend of mine had decided to leave with me, but he was luckier with the airplane ticket, so he left like 3 months before me. And we knew somebody in Albany, so we're just like, okay, let's do it, so we don't have to pay $1,000 for some studio in New York City. That was the main goal. I still think that maybe it would have been okay to live in New York City at that time, but that's the decision I made, so that's what happened.
So you're working on your memoir right now, right? Or how far along are you, or have you even started writing it?
No, it's finished. It's been finished for some time, and it got accepted by a press that went under, maybe or semi under during the pandemic, and so they stopped responding to my emails. And I started submitting it again, and it just got accepted. Just won that small contest, but most of it was written several years ago. But I keep revising it, so it's getting better. I just re-revised it for this publication, and working with this wonderful nonfiction writer Thomas Larson. That's his memoir about memoir. So he's my editor for this memoir of mine, and he's a very knowledgeable person in that field. He's given me some really good feedback, and still going back and forth about some details.
And you have a title for that again, or?
Yes, it's called A Broken Russia Inside Me.
Okay. And you're hoping that will be released in about a year or so?
Yes, it's scheduled for release in April or May of 2026.
And I heard a dog. Do you have a dog that lives with you?
We have two dogs. We have two Australian Shepherds who are very fun and have a lot of opinions too. So sometimes you get to hear them.
I'm a dog lover myself. So.
Oh, cool. What kind do you have?
I have a mutt who kind of looks like a terrier, but we've never quite figured out what her DNA is. We did one of those embark tests, and she came back with like 5 or 6 different breeds, and none of them looked like the type of breed you would think it would look like. She looks like a little kind of border terrier type, very scruffy. Yeah, she's cute. When she gets really scruffy, she looks like the Tramp from Lady and the Tramp. I don't know if you remember that Disney movie, and
vaguely, yeah,
looking skinny, ratty look. Looks like been out in the alleyways.
That's cool.
So yeah, I think that the book sounds great. I hope that it gets a lot of press, a lot of interest, some good reviews on top of it. And again, it's called A Bag Full of Stones, and it's released on May 29th of 2025. Is there anything else that you wanted to mention or ask me or whatever?
So I hear that you're running for an elected post. So can you tell me more about it? I'm really fascinated by this notion.
So I had thought about it in reaction to the first Trump election in 2016 into 2017, and it boggles my mind that people are so divided and hateful, and the xenophobia, especially against immigrants who are doing good things for our society. And I feel, when we talk about the American dream and what is the definition of the American dream, that American dream is like, it's a two-part, I think, equation. It's the people who are native to this country, who were here before the immigrants arrived. And then it's the immigrants and the diversity that came with the immigrants and the reasons why they came here, like the freedoms that they didn't have in these other countries. And people who come to this country, from what I've seen as an immigration attorney, they give back to the country in multiples. They love this place. They love that this country has given them an opportunity to, thrive and maybe, elevate up in whatever field they're in, or give them the ability to have the freedom to speak, the freedom to dissent without being targeted for doing so, which I see happen all the time. It's the reason my clients a lot of times come here, is because they've dissented or they disagree with the authoritarian government that they're fleeing. And to see that happening in our backyard in this country, and not only happening, but happening in some ways, like on a rapid pace right now, with the way that this administration is just obliterating our rights and our Constitution. I just looked at myself. I think a lot of times you'll look at yourself in the mirror and you'll have thoughts of like, what could I do to make a difference? And so in your case, you wrote a book, and you have, ways, mechanisms to share your thoughts, whether it be in fiction or nonfiction or in poetry. Mine has always been, I just share my thoughts out loud on, social media. And it just finally got to the point where I said, I just can't sit here and see it happen without taking another step and doing something that may not be, in my normal, DNA, but I also see it as now's a good time for people who are not typical politicians or people who you would generally think would be good, at politicking, to step up and do this. And also, as an immigration lawyer, I have a very unique perspective, because I do see, how this system forces people to do things what would not be considered the right way or breaking the law, because we don't really have a very good system that allows people to process, through that. And so I think educating people on that, part of the reason I do this podcast is to do that, to educate people so they can see that immigrants are here because a lot of times out of necessity, and a lot of times because they want to have these opportunities. And we need to continue to cultivate that. We shouldn't be, we should be building these bridges and not walls. And so there you go. I mean, I just said enough's enough. I'm going to do this. And here I am now running for Congress.
That's wonderful. I wish you all sorts of luck with that. It's just so noble of you to step over that, maybe not having that, that propensity for politics to begin with, but to stepping forward and doing that. I really appreciate that.
Thank you. And, the way I see it is, if I win this and I can maybe make a difference in some way in some people's lives, then I can look back and say, at a time when we saw the rise of authoritarianism, and looking at, the histories of people like yourself, my family who came here after World War II and were Holocaust survivors, others who have come here for, security and for a new, life and hope. I can look back and say, you know what? I made it my life's goal to try to, do that. And that's always been what I've done in the work I do. So, it'll be a fulfilling, process regardless of the result.
Definitely, but I hope the results are good because we need people like you in those roles.
So again, the book is called A Bag Full of Stones. You'll be able to purchase it. In fact, I think you can pre-order it on Amazon. Or again, I'm going to see if I can roll this out next week so that it can be out before it rolls out on the 29th. Actually, wow, we're on the 18th now as we're recording this. So, and again, the man I'm speaking with is Tola. Also, full name is Anatoly Molotkov. And I really appreciate you joining me and chatting with me and, sharing some of your inspiration and background and so forth.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a wonderful honor and also a very, very fun conversation. I've had a lot of fun, and I can't believe that as much time has passed since we started.
It's an hour.
It's really fun. Thank you.
So, A Bag Full of Stones. Look for it on Amazon. And thank you to Emma, my daughter, who is my producer. She's finishing up her junior year in high school, and she's very tech savvy. So thank you, Emma, for helping make Tola and I sound good.
Thanks, Emma. Appreciate it.